Hi everyone, welcome to North and South Podcasts. This is a politics episode. Please follow us on @North Podcasts on Twitter. Feel free to contribute financially through coffee.com. Details will be in the notes, that's ko-fi, and check for North and South Podcasts. Please share, send it to your families, rate, whatever you can to promote this podcast. The more people that promote it and like it and get something from it, the better it is for everyone. Hope you're all okay. I last did a few of my Just Me Talking podcasts just before Christmas, and I was focusing on a couple of little things to do with exercise and making changes in your life. This is a politics podcast, and I'm going to read an article called Shortcuts by Abby Innes from the London Review of Books. And this really nailed how I feel about modern Britain politically. As you know, I want people to be engaged with politics. I want people to be involved in local politics, national politics, international politics. When people say, oh, you only vote, that's not politics. That's just one tiny little thing you do every now and again. Politics is what you do every day. It's who gets what. It's how much you get for doing something. It's privilege. It's all the different things in society that make us the society that it is. People often say, oh, this is the best that it is. Like Leibniz said, the world is the best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire said, no, it's not. We can do better. And I'm very, very concerned about the way things are at the moment. And I side with Voltaire on that one. I'm going to read you this article and I'll make a few comments as I'm going through, and then I'll do a little summary. I hope you find it useful. The link to the article will be in the podcast notes as well. When MPs are caught pursuing their second jobs at the expense of their first, we are right to call it out for what it is. Corruption, defined as the abuse of public office for private gain. The problem is structural, however. Corporate state capture is the highest point of political corruption, when private interests can rig the legislative process in their favour. After 40 years of neoliberal reforms, British MPs have extremely close ties to business. The state's vulnerability to conflicts of interest and corruption are a feature of modern government, not an aberration, and perhaps the least of the matter is the massive and continuous waste of taxpayers' money it entails. Now, this is me talking for the next minute. When a leftist or liberal government wants to spend money on a big project, it is absolutely ripped apart by conservatives and the right-wing press. However, when they throw huge amounts of money, taxpayers' money, down corporate channels to provide a public service, that is seemingly okay with no media coverage. One of the problems with things like Partygate and Boris being a corrupt liar and a bit of a clown is that it actually masks the deeper problems that people don't always hear about and know about, which is the endemic corruption. You hear a little bit about it, but it's not really covered in the media because people feel that, oh, do we really want to do this? Isn't that what governments do, kind of thing? No, it's not. And it's got tremendously worse since Brexit and since Boris Johnson came to power in the 2019 general election in particular. I'll continue with the article now. Since the rise of the new public management under Thatcher, agenda setting and policy making have increasingly been outsourced to professional consultancies, third sector agencies, law and accountability firms, and privately sponsored think tanks. There has also been an increase in direct business involvement in the internal operations of the state via senior civil service recruitment, and as a result of the proliferation of special advisors and non-executive directors, typically drawn from the corporate sector. Non-executive directors can advise on recruitment and management and chair audit and risk committees. They can also recommend the dismissal of permanent secretaries. Many of these senior officials and advisors return to the private sector. It is not called the revolving door for nothing. All this matters because many of the British state's core responsibilities have been outsourced to the companies that now constitute the public service industry sector. A third of central government spending is currently contracted out. As a result, the state is porous to business interests to a degree that is exceptional among established democracies. In the sociologist Colin Crouch's description, it has become a semi-permeable membrane. Governments refrain from interfering in the private sector, but allow business ever greater access to public authority and revenue. In countries that Britain likes to look down on as corrupt, this level of access costs money and sometimes lives, but it is hardly a mark of superiority that successive UK governments have granted the same forms of influence as a matter of deliberate policy, often for free. We are not just foolish, we are also cheap. Okay, this is me now. Now, if that was happening in a foreign country, we would just call that corruption. We would say that is a failure of transparency and accountability. We'd say that people were on the make. We'd say that that is dodgy. That is not a separation of powers. It's not a declaration of clear interests. It's just not good enough. Yet, in the current climate, it seems okay for people to get away with corrupt practices hidden in plain sight when a lot of the key newspapers and a lot of the key media don't even focus on those things. Think about the Panama Papers and how quickly that just dissolved into nothingness. This is corruption and people making money while the rest of us, the average person in the street, has to pay a lot of tax and to put up with a deterioration of living standards and a deterioration of public services. Back to the article. The theoretical assumptions that underpin such policies are entirely utopian. They hold that the removal of forms of state regulation and intervention doesn't just improve competitiveness, it shifts the entire political economy towards a general equilibrium in which demand and supply are matched with perfect, frictionless efficiency. This is the exact mirror of the Soviet belief in central planning. A truly efficient market and perfect central planning are formally the same. The only distinction is whether the all-informing price mechanism can be administered. When Vilfredo Pareto first discussed the matching of supply and demand at the turn of the 20th century, he did so as a theoretical exercise. Put into practice, these assumptions lead governments to embrace political determinism. They promise a world of homeostatic harmony, but require a population that behaves with predictable and universal rationality, and companies that aim only at productive development. This is me now. This basically makes out that market fundamentalism and free markets can do what they like, and that is in everyone's best interests. And if that isn't utopian, I don't know what is. Back to the article. In Britain, this idealism has made every government since 1979 deeply complacent about the increasing dysfunction of Britain's actual businesses, especially its large traded businesses. Neoliberalism teaches that higher corporate profits will automatically be recycled as investment by omniscient shareholders, but this is to confuse a theoretical axiom dependent on closed system reasoning for the real world, in which financial markets exist and are increasingly extractive. In the real deregulated financial world, corporate profits and dividend payouts have been growing for decades, but rather than being reinvested, they have more obviously been frittered away on consumption or put into entirely unproductive financial speculation, or, happier still, placed in offshore tax havens, as defended by Geoffrey Cox, the former Attorney General, for a fee of £1,000 an hour. Andrew Haldane, the former chief economist at the Bank of England, has rightly argued that Britain's traded companies are cannibalising themselves. A report by the economists Adrian Buller and Benjamin Brown earlier this year found that in 2020, aggregate dividend payouts by the FTSE 350 represented some 90% of pre-tax profit. This figure has been rising for 2 decades, despite stagnating real wages and productivity and unparalleled accumulation of corporate debt. Yet Rishi Sunak has further withdrawn the state from climate interventions on the basis that the market will lead us to net zero. His adherence to the efficient market hypothesis, which requires that asset prices reflect all available data and that a self-regulating financial sector will converge on the correct pricing of risk, is quite the punt, given that just over a decade ago, the global financial crisis proved definitively that the AMH is the mother of all grifts. As Karl Polanyi wrote in 1944, To suppose that there exists some smoothly functioning automatic mechanism of adjustment which preserves equilibrium, if only we trust to methods of laissez-faire, is a doctrinaire delusion which disregards the lessons of historical experience without having behind it the support of sound theory. Britain's large public sector industry firms exhibit all the dysfunctions of financialised corporations. Carillion and Interrev did go bust as a consequence of excessive profit-taking at the taxpayer's expense, and to go bust in a rentier oligarchy takes real effort. Serco, G4S, Capita and the like tend to sweat their contracts and abuse their employment conditions and their pension entitlements to minimise their investment and to indebt themselves in order to maximise profits. In this respect, the nature of state capture in the UK is particularly dangerous for social welfare. The Public Accounts Committee has been warning for years that Britain's structural dependency upon these companies makes them too big to fail. The post-war British state had far clearer legal and organisational boundaries separating public and private realms. This isn't to say that governments were immune from corruption, but the systematic opportunities were fewer. Contrary to the fantasy of the modern state withering away to its night watchman minimum, our increasingly centralised polity has become a giant of procurement. Multiplying contractual relationships have transferred whole bodies of public spending from statutory to contract law, where they disappear under the cloak of commercial confidentiality. Academy schools are one example of this. Even parliamentary select committees have complained that they are unable to scrutinise the financial details. The result is a system of direct corporate government relations, chronic contractual underperformance, and stymied target-based bureaucracy. This is me speaking now. As things go into the private sector, they then disappear under commercial confidentiality and there's no transparency. And when this is raised, these people have got no responses to that. They think that the market itself is democracy. When people's services are provided by someone who you can't even contact and you can't find out the information about, that is not good enough. When I did trade union work, the academies, some of the academy chains in the schools just didn't want to speak about anything or open their books to anything or have to explain themselves like state sector schools did. Back to the article. In 2011, the Cabinet Office was forced to create a body called Crown Representatives to coordinate the strategic suppliers of important goods and services. In the last financial year, these strategic suppliers earned $15.7 billion in government contracts. As the market analyst Tussell has reported, this close proximity to the heart of government offers unrivaled liaison opportunities with key procurement stakeholders. Yet Crown representatives completely fail to spot the imminent demise of Carillion and will probably fail to prevent the next case. The only obligation companies are under, and therefore the only leverage available to Crown representatives, is to report anything that may present a risk to government. And one of the things with these, this is me speaking, these private sector companies, it's a win-win. It's like if they don't earn lots of money, they can get bailed out and basically they'll be allowed to get away with things. Look at the test and trace fiasco. The billions thrown at that. Think about how the media goes on about like, oh, we're spending this much on foreign aid or on benefits, which mostly goes to people who are in work, etc., etc. And yet these huge amounts of money are allowed to go into the private sector with very little scrutiny. Back to the article. The privileged access given to business has also had the effect of tilting the playing field against those other social interest groups that must compete for the government's attention, and it has encouraged increasingly large donations to all political parties by companies seeking preferential treatment. The UK is the third largest lobbying industry in the world. When ministers and prime ministers with no experience in corporate governance retire into jobs in sectors that were once supposed to regulate at pay rates beyond the wildest dreams of the average voter, are we really meant to believe that they are recruited for their good judgment? There remains a near total lack of legal regulation around some of the most serious systemic risks in the self-regulation principle held by MPs. Do you ever hear this in the Mail, the Express, the Sun, the Telegraph, and the BBC? Very, very little of this is ever covered. And it's just absolutely scandalous, the lack of transparency and the corruption and the elitism that is masqueraded. Back to the article. The term regulatory drift describes what happens when formal rules are deliberately maintained in the face of major shifts in practice, even as they cease to be effective. The Cross-Party Committee on Standards and Public Life, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, and the Public Accounts Select Committee have repeatedly called on government to tighten the rules around conflicts of interest, second jobs, party finance, consultancy, lobbying, and the revolving door between government and the private sector. They have all been rebuffed. This kind of oversight would have violated many of the core assumptions of the neoliberal project, that business actors are honourable wealth builders for the nation, that self-regulation is superior to state action, and that rational self-interest confers no unacceptable social harm. The public reaction has been one of rising distrust in political elites and anger with the institutional status quo. Now it's me speaking. One of the dangers is that everyone then says, oh, we're plague on all our houses, they're all as bad as each other. They're not. You need to look at the nature of these parties, the ideologies they advocate, scratch the surface and look at the corruption. Some of them are at it far more than others, and it is not good enough to say that they are all the same. Back to the article. Despite the widespread perception that politicians are in it for themselves, many MPs, the majority as far as we can tell, resist the opportunities for self-enrichment that are now part of the fabric of political life. The culture of self-restraint and public service inherited from the post-war era has greatly weakened, however. A fifth of the new Conservative MPs elected in 2019 previously worked in lobbying or public relations. We also know that the greater an MP's adherence to economic libertarianism, the more likely they are to cross the line. Boris Johnson's cabinet is comprised of his party's most committed economic libertarians. Now, 10 years ago, the cabinet was full of millionaires, and they're making decisions about everyone else. Now we've got a cabinet who are committed to economic libertarianism, but also they're incompetent and they are dodgy. They are incompetent and dodgy, and it makes me sick. Back to the article. The example of other countries shows that when corporate state capture takes hold, political parties risk being dominated by people who enter politics for private gain. Once this happens, elections become the point of access for what is primarily a financial market, with political parties as corporate brokers overseeing the continuous distribution of public revenue and rents into private hands. A populist authoritarian politics is the most effective way to corner the market. Ideology matters so much here because for economic libertarians, it isn't obvious that there is any intrinsic moral injunction against running a private sideline while in public service. Owen Paterson may be entirely sincere when he says that he holds his integrity very dear. As Elaine Supiat points out, from the perspective of the total market, society is simply a swarm of contracting particles whose relations to each other are based purely on calculated self-interest. Calculation, and hence the contract, thus comes to occupy the place previously assigned to the law as the normative reference. For economic libertarians, the marketplace is the sphere of true freedom, the only republic. In practice, however, the absence of a viable social contract in late-stage materialist utopias means that the nexus between the governing regime and its society becomes that of a protection racket. Insofar as Sunak has proved keen on public spending, it has been prompted more obviously by political calculation than the public interest. When the £1 billion Towns Fund was announced in January, 39 of the 45 areas chosen had a Conservative MP. Money is being directed at well-off Tory constituencies, while poorer cities, such as Labour voting Salford, are relegated to a lower funding tier. As the sociologist Ken Jauer concluded of the USSR under Brezhnev, the aim seems to have been to take the party's organisational corruption and elevate it to the status of an organisational principle. Conservative MPs need to ask themselves whether they are happy to let their government, do the same. End of article by RBNS, which is called Shortcuts from the London Review of Books, which will be in the notes for this podcast. The big concern here is particularly since 2019, we've seen increasing authoritarianist tendencies in this country. We've seen increasing corruption in this country. We've seen a disregard for the separation of powers, a disregard for transparency, outright lying at the heart and centre of government. and it's Partygate that is likely to bring the Prime Minister down. But don't get me wrong, he'll probably deny it, and when I release this, a few things might have happened since then. But we are on a very, very slippery slope. In 2016, with the election of Donald Trump, in 2016, with Brexit in this country, the weakening of the European Union, the weakening of the UK, the disregard for democratic values by the United States, which isn't over yet, has weakened liberal democracy around the world. We have got no ability to take the moral high ground with anything. Joe Biden might be able to do it to an extent. We can't in the UK because we have got an absolute joke shop, wannabe authoritarian running our government at the moment. Boris Johnson, he is a narcissist, he is a Machiavellian, and he is a sociopath. Now, I'm going to take that all back because he's none of those things. Donald Trump is all three of those things, and he may well be back. But certainly Johnson is a Machiavellian, and he will do anything to keep hold of power. And for him, the rules of eating and looking after your mates, lying through your teeth, this idea that you are born to rule and he is the best, seems to be at the heart of government. Since 2007, since the economic downturn, things have become quite fractured. Over the last 5 years, particularly either side of the Atlantic, things have become very fractured indeed. And one of the problems with authoritarianism and populism is it aims to limit what the judiciary can do, things such as judicial review. It wants to appeal to the ordinary person beyond elites, but they are the elite. Boris and his millionaire friends and his mates, they are the elite, and they're filling the pockets. And he's making out that he's a man of the people. Look at Trump. I'm a man of the people. Lying in his own pockets. No transparency. Everyone who went near him got destroyed. Look at Johnson, how many people he's let hang. Do we want these people? You wouldn't leave them in charge of your house. You wouldn't go away for 2 weeks and leave Trump or Johnson in charge of your house. And yet there they are, running governments. And Trump may well be back. Now, some people say, oh yeah, but, they do give us some things, don't they? And there are some good things about them, like if you like Brexit, if you like fear of the other. Now, we're not quite as bad as the US in terms of our TV media and social media, but we are getting there. But our print media is basically giving Boris a free card. And yet things might get better. Mussolini made the trains run on time. Authoritarianism, populism, all that stuff. Yet there are benefits to it, but it's not a long-term plan, and then you cannot get rid of dodgy governments and bad governments. Look at the electoral bill, voter ID. Look at the way the Parliamentary Commission on Standards is being ignored. They're trying to give ministers like Priti Patel more power. We're ending the separation of powers. Corruption is endemic. Lying is now front and centre. Another country doing this, there would be rightful criticism of that country. How do we all feel? There's more inequality, we're poorer, it's just not good enough. And who do we blame and scapegoat? People on boats trying to get across the English Channel. Yeah, nice one. They're really the cause of all our problems. Populism and authoritarianism can lead to some short-term gain, but the lack of transparency and the endemic corruption that goes hand in hand with that, it's not good enough. It's effectively a mafia state. Now, we're not quite there yet. What would Trump have done if he could have got away with it? What is Boris Johnson doing? What would he do if he could truly get away with it? He's a Machiavellian. He would do anything. He once said he wanted a journalist to be beaten up. If that isn't a mafia state, I don't know what is. Look after your mates. Destroy your enemy by all means. Absolutely awful. And things like global warming, when we're all meant to be coming together, working out better economic conditions, defending liberal democracy. Where are we? We can do better than this, folks. And I've said before, despite what might be considered the worsening political situation in the UK since 2016 and 2019, at least Trump got kicked out. Maybe there'll be some normalisation again, and authoritarian populist governments will go into decline again. We'll have spreading democracy, less inequality, etc. But we've all got to do our bit. Think about what you're looking at, what you're watching, what you're reading. Watch what's in your coffee. Jim Rome, a business philosopher, used to always say, You need to watch what people put in your coffee, because if they're putting poison in your coffee, that'll be what you're getting and you don't even know it. So be aware of where you're getting your information from. Know your mind, know your prejudices, get educated, join groups, think about how you can help people to make this place, this world, a better place. And let's see what we can do together. But anyway, I don't want to sound too negative there, but that's my state of the world address. And we all need to do our bit to stop authoritarianism, corruption and populism from taking over our country. Cheers, and I'll speak to you later.